The cabin perched at the edge of the world, or so it felt that evening when the sun died behind the saw-toothed peaks and the trees cast long shadows like watchful sentinels. He had driven 6 hours on roads that wound like ancient serpents, hoping for quiet, maybe even a little peace. He got a splinter in his thumb from the porch railing instead. He muttered a few choice curses at the wood as he fumbled for the key, but the door swung open without much effort, like it had been waiting for him all these years. Inside, the air smelled of pine needles and burnt coffee, as though the last occupant had left in a hurry. Or maybe they'd just been a terrible cook. He dropped his duffel bag next to the fireplace and kicked at a pile of newspapers that looked older than his mother's garden gnome collection. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wind through the rafters. Silent enough to hear the echo of his own thoughts, which he'd been trying to avoid since Tuesday. Or maybe Wednesday. He'd lost track. He rummaged through the cabinets, half expecting to find a rat playing cards with a raccoon. But all he found was a half-eaten box of crackers and a can of beans that had expired the same year the internet was born. He snorted. "Well, at least dinner's sorted," he said, and the words bounced off the walls, filling the empty space with a strange sort of comfort. But then, something shifted. A whisper of movement, too delicate to be the wind. He paused, spoon in midair, his brain doing the slow dance of denial. The thought occurred to him that maybe the cabin came with a ghost, some tragic pioneer who died of boredom waiting for broadband. He turned, half expecting to see a headless lumberjack, but instead saw nothing, just the fireplace and the shadows it cast on the floor. He decided to laugh it off, though his heart was hammering like a bad cover band. "If you're a ghost, at least make yourself useful and cook these beans," he muttered. He cracked the can open and pretended the hiss of escaping air was an answer. A flash of blue caught his eye, just a flicker. He dropped the spoon. It clattered on the floor and rolled under the couch, never to be seen again. He froze, staring at the darkness where the flash had been. He could almost hear his own pulse in his ears. The tension thickened, but he squashed it down with a breathless laugh. "Okay, sure. Blue ghosts. That's new." He shuffled toward the shadows, every step a negotiation between bravery and the strong desire to turn around and run back to his car. A shape shifted, a leg, maybe an arm. He stopped cold, mouth dry. His engineer's brain tried to logic it out. Blue? Could be a trick of the light. Or the beans. They were at least a decade past edible. Another movement, this time unmistakable. A small figure crouched by the old radio console, its skin a shimmering cobalt that defied every rule of physics he'd ever memorized. Her eyes, huge and luminous, blinked at him like twin moons. She was barefoot, wearing what looked like a tattered flight suit stitched together with wires and mismatched fabrics. "Hey," he blurted, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Nice outfit." He instantly regretted it, but her lips curved, tentative, uncertain, like she was trying to remember how to smile. He swallowed. "You, need some help with the radio?" She tilted her head, studying him with the intensity of 1,000 NASA engineers. And then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 frequencies all at once, she whispered something he didn't understand. The radio crackled behind her, spitting sparks. He laughed. He couldn't help it. "Okay, so the beans are haunted, the radio's possessed, and there's a blue lady in my living room. I'm living in a B-movie, right?" She blinked again, confusion written in every line of her delicate features. Then she raised a small, trembling hand and pointed at him. The air smelled like ozone and destiny. He forgot about the beans. This was definitely not going to be a quiet weekend. He woke the next morning tangled in a cocoon of blankets, his dreams a tangle of blue eyes and star maps that refused to make sense. The air was still thick with the faint smell of burnt coffee, or maybe that was just the residue of last night's panic. He rubbed his eyes and glanced around, half expecting her to be gone like a half-remembered dream. But there she was, sitting cross-legged on the wooden floor, poking at a disassembled toaster with a screwdriver that definitely wasn't from his toolbox. "You're still here," he mumbled, voice sticky with sleep and disbelief. She looked up, her head tilting like a curious bird, and said something that sounded like a cross between a dial-up modem and a lullaby. He grinned despite the absurdity. Right. Universal translator not included. Figures. He shuffled to the kitchen, well, the corner with a stove and a sink that leaked optimism at best, and fumbled for coffee. She watched him with the intensity of a science fair judge evaluating a baking soda volcano. Want some? He asked, waving the mug like a peace offering. She reached for it, cautious, fingers trembling. She took a sip, and her face contorted in a way that reminded him of a cat discovering a lemon. She coughed, a sound like a broken walkie-talkie. Yeah, it's bad, he agreed, but it's the only thing keeping me human at this point. She turned back to her toaster project, poking the exposed wires with what looked suspiciously like a hairpin. Sparks flew, and a whiff of ozone filled the cabin. He flinched. You're not gonna blow us up, are you? She glanced at him with wide, innocent eyes and then returned to her work, completely ignoring his question. He considered this a qualified maybe. Sitting on the worn-out couch, he watched her like a spectator at a weird sporting event. Every so often, she'd glance his way, her eyes flickering with what might have been amusement or maybe mild disgust. He couldn't tell. So, he began, trying to fill the silence. You from around here? She gave him a look that said, obviously not, you idiot. He chuckled. Yeah, I didn't think so. The blue skin kinda gives it away. She held up a small device that looked like a cross between a calculator and a sea urchin. It glowed faintly, pulsing in sync with the light from the cracked window. She pointed at it, then at the ceiling, then at him. He blinked. You want me to fix the roof? Or call ET? Her head tilted again, and she gave a frustrated sigh that sounded suspiciously like a malfunctioning synthesizer. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and tried to mimic her gestures. You're trying to get home? Her eyes lit up like a Christmas tree. He felt a small thrill of triumph, like winning a game of charades on hard mode. She nodded vigorously, her blue hair shimmering like a glitch in the Matrix. Okay, he said, raising his hands. Let's think this through. He rummaged through the clutter, coming up with a tangle of wires, a pair of walkie-talkies, and a broken ham radio that might have belonged to his uncle. You think this can talk to your people? She took the radio like it was a sacred relic, turning it over and over with a reverence that made him feel weirdly protective of the piece of junk. Hey, if anyone can make it work, it's you, he said, giving her a thumbs up. She blinked, stared at his thumb, then tentatively gave him one back. He laughed so hard he nearly fell off the couch. Okay, we're officially a team, he announced. She smiled, small but real. And for a moment, he felt like he'd found something he hadn't known he was missing. He stood up, stretching, and glanced at the window. The sun was rising, casting long fingers of light across the floorboards. Guess we'd better get to work, he said. She looked at him with determination in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at making this work. He rummaged through the cabin like a raccoon on a mission, tossing aside ancient extension cords, old batteries that might have been alive once, and a tangle of Christmas lights from a holiday he couldn't remember celebrating. She watched him from her perch on the couch, eyes blinking in that slow, curious way she had, like he was a puzzle she hadn't solved yet. Don't give me that look, he muttered, untangling a knotted ball of wires that looked like an electric spider's web. I'm an engineer, not a wizard, she hummed, a sound like the wind whispering through broken glass. He wasn't sure if it was approval or a judgment call on his organizational skills. He laid the wires out on the floor like a sacred offering, arranging them in a pattern that might have made sense to him once upon a time. Okay, so, hypothetically, if we cross the input here, he muttered, poking at a rusty connector with a pencil, and ground this here, we might just get enough power to contact whoever it is you're trying to reach. She cocked her head, eyes glimmering. Then she reached for the pencil like it was an alien artifact, sniffed it suspiciously, and gave it back with a half-smile that made his heart do a stupid little skip. Glad we're on the same page, he said, rolling his eyes. Now let's talk about the antenna. He rummaged around until he found an old coat hanger, which he bent into a shape that might have been a question mark. She watched him with the solemnity of a high priestess, then reached out and attached a small, blinking device to the end. He jumped. Where'd you get that? She shrugged as if every blue-skinned alien carried emergency starship parts in their pockets. Okay, he said, rubbing his temples. So we've got an antenna. We've got a radio that may or may not function. We've got, he looked at her tattered flight suit, at the gleaming device now flickering like a dying star. We've got you, so, he threw his hands up. Let's see what happens. She nodded, her face solemn. Then, with the same grace she'd used to fix his toaster that morning, she bent over the contraption and tapped a sequence on the device, her fingers moving with a speed and precision that made him feel like a toddler with a crayon. Sparks danced from the wires, and the radio crackled to life with a burst of static that rattled his teeth. He flinched. Holy! He cut himself off, half laughing, half terrified. Wow, that's something. She grinned, a wide, delighted smile that transformed her face into something that belonged to every star he'd ever wished on as a kid. A voice emerged from the radio, strange, garbled, echoing with too many syllables and a tone that felt like it was pulling at the edges of reality. He stared at it, then at her. Is that them? She nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes, and he felt a strange lump in his throat. Okay, he said, taking a deep breath. So we've got contact. Great. Fantastic. Now what? She didn't answer, just held the radio close, whispering to it in that language that felt like music and static and the hum of the stars all at once. He watched her, heart pounding with a mix of fear and wonder and, if he was honest, a kind of giddy excitement. I'm going to need more coffee, he muttered, mostly to himself. She looked up at him, confusion in her eyes, then mimicked his earlier sip-and-gag routine. He laughed, a real laugh that bounced off the cabin walls. Okay, he said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. No coffee. Got it. Let's stick to the space radio, huh? She nodded, serious as a judge, and he felt a surge of something warm and strange in his chest. He sat down next to her, close enough that their shoulders brushed, and together they listened as the voice on the radio spoke secrets of the stars, and maybe, just maybe, a way home. He woke to the sound of her voice humming through the radio, a melody that felt like it had been borrowed from a distant galaxy. Blinking against the morning light, he saw her cross-legged on the floor, blue fingers dancing over dials and wires, like a concert pianist in a cosmic symphony. She glanced at him, eyes twinkling, and then returned to her task. Morning, he croaked, his voice a patchwork of sleep and confusion. I assume you slept somewhere? She pointed at the couch, then at the floor, then shrugged as if sleep was an optional feature she'd never downloaded. He stretched, bones popping like old bubble wrap, and stumbled toward the kitchen corner. Coffee's on, he announced grandly. Though the pot had started to sound like an asthmatic robot lately, she wrinkled her nose in that way that meant she wasn't a fan of human beverages. Sitting down beside her, he watched her work the makeshift communicator, its wires tangled like a cosmic hairball. Every so often it crackled, spitting static and what might have been words from a place he couldn't imagine. She adjusted a knob, muttered something that sounded suspiciously like interstellar cursing, and banged it with the palm of her hand. He leaned in. Need a hand? I've got thumbs and... She waved him off with an exasperated sigh. He grinned. Fine. You're the brains of the operation. The radio squealed like a dying comet and then settled into a low hum. A voice emerged, soft, metallic, and oddly polite. He tilted his head, half expecting it to demand a tip. She gasped, her eyes wide as if the stars themselves had reached through the wires to greet her. He tried to catch a word, but it was all gibberish to him. Let me guess, he deadpanned. It says, take me to your leader. She gave him a look that could have fried a neutron star. He laughed, raising his hands in surrender. Okay, I'll let you handle the intergalactic customer service. She spoke into the device, her voice steady but tinged with something, fear maybe, or hope. He tried not to intrude, but the weight of her words pulled at him. She gestured for him to sit, and he obeyed, feeling like a kid in a detention, waiting for the principal to call his name. The voice from the radio changed, now a chorus of layered echoes that seemed to dance with a rhythm he couldn't follow. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and reached for his hand. He took it, surprised by the warmth of her touch. So, good news or bad news, he asked, his voice a joke wrapped in a question. She smiled, a small, brave thing, and mimicked his thumbs up from the day before. He laughed, feeling something loosen in his chest. Okay, team thumbs up it is, he said, squeezing her hand. She tapped a few more buttons, and the device fizzed and popped, then spat out a bright beam of light that sliced through the cabin like a blade of sunrise. He jumped back. Okay, not what I was expecting, he said, heart pounding. She giggled, a sound like stardust in a wind chime, and pressed the device to her chest. The beam faded, leaving a small, glowing sphere that hovered between them. Okay, he said, pointing at the sphere. This is either a tiny Death Star or a really fancy disco ball. She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the smile that curled her lips. Together they leaned in as the sphere unfolded like a mechanical flower, revealing a star map that shimmered and shifted, showing places he couldn't name and paths he couldn't follow. She pointed at a single point, a star that pulsed like a heartbeat, and then at herself. He understood as much as he could. Home. All right, he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Let's get you home. She beamed, eyes bright as twin suns, and he felt something shift in the universe, like maybe this was the moment he'd been waiting for without even knowing it. Coffee's still terrible, he said, and she laughed, the sound echoing through the cabin like hope. The sphere floated between them like a tiny sun, pulsing with a steady glow that felt both comforting and terrifying. He stared at it, half expecting it to start singing show tunes. Instead, it hummed with a low musical tone that seemed to harmonize with her voice as she spoke into it, her words a mix of static and stardust. She glanced at him, her eyes bright with determination and something like relief. He crossed his arms, trying to look serious, but the grin kept breaking through. So, you've got your cosmic GPS working. That's great. Now all we need is a spaceship, a pilot's license, and maybe an intergalactic Uber. She blinked, then let out a laugh that sounded like a chime in a windstorm. He chuckled too, feeling the weight of the past days lifting from his shoulders like an old worn-out coat. She gestured for him to come closer, her fingers dancing over the device. He watched as a small holographic interface bloomed from its center, lines of stars and coordinates swirling like a cosmic roadmap. She pointed at one cluster, a place he couldn't name but somehow recognized in his gut. Home? He asked softly. She nodded, her expression softening. His heart did a little tap dance in his chest. Then let's get you there. She tilted her head, eyes wide, as if she hadn't expected him to say that. Hey, he said, grinning. You fixed my toaster. Least I can do is help you get back to your people. Together, they started assembling the makeshift communication rig that had grown from a tangle of wires into something that might have made an intergalactic engineer weep tears of pride or laughter. She hummed a tune that made the air feel lighter, and he found himself humming along. The radio crackled and a voice, clearer now but still layered like a cosmic echo, came through. She listened, eyes wide, nodding, tears threatening at the corners. He reached over and squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back like a lifeline. Then came the hardest part. Goodbye. He tried to lighten the mood. So, when you get home, tell them Earth has terrible coffee and even worse reality TV, okay? She giggled, wiping her eyes. And, if you ever want to come back, maybe bring a translator or a cosmic phrasebook next time. She laughed again, a sound that felt like a sunrise after a long, dark night. She stood, the device glowing in her hands. The sphere pulsed, and a beam of light shot upward, a thin thread connecting her to the stars above. She turned to him, eyes bright. I guess this is it, huh? He said, his voice catching in his throat. She nodded, pressing a small metallic object into his palm, a keepsake maybe, or a cosmic friendship bracelet. Hey, he said, tears he'd been holding back now shining in his eyes. Thanks for fixing more than my toaster. She smiled, eyes shining like the night sky, and stepped into the light. He blinked, and she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of ozone and a warmth in his chest that refused to fade. He stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she'd been. Then he looked down at the object in his hand, a small, crystalline shard that pulsed with a soft, steady glow. He grinned. Well, he muttered, guess I'm a part-time intergalactic ambassador now. Outside, the stars glimmered like old friends. He took a deep breath, feeling different, lighter, maybe even braver. He thought about all the questions he'd never get to ask her, and all the answers she'd given him without words. He turned back toward the cabin, the smell of burnt coffee waiting like an old joke. He laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, definitely gonna need to work on the coffee. The radio crackled behind him, a voice whispering like a promise in the static. He smiled. And maybe I'll figure the rest out too. He pocketed the crystal and stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him, ready for whatever adventure came next.